So I'm going to try and unpack in the next 20 minutes why the Zondo Commission is important and what happened prior to that. But I think the important thing is to understand that hindsight is an exact science. And if we look back, we start to see the picture of state capture and what was happening. So I think firstly, it's important to know that there is an anatomy to corruption, and it requires three things. It requires dishonest people in positions of power with funds that can be illicitly gained. And those three elements play out very strongly in any form of corruption. But there's a formula for corruption. It's quite a simple one. It unfolds when the gains are greater than the penalty, multiplied by the likelihood of prosecution. So if you just look at that, there's a 100 million rand opportunity to be gained in a corrupt deal. Well, what are the penalties? Variable fines, 18 years imprisonment, loss of jobs, although that doesn't always happen. Sometimes in the ANC you get promoted if you're corrupt. You get extra jobs. You just get moved. But it's this issue that's important. This factor of, is there impunity? Zero, are you going to get prosecuted or not? And if you are, if the rule of law flows and it's very, very strong, as it is in many countries, and the prosecution stakes are high, well then it's this issue around jail time, 18 years. I mean, sometimes you might take a chance and want to have that money stashed somewhere else and go and sit for a few years in prison. But not so if the stakes are higher in that space. If it's 18 years, if you get heavy fines as well, you're going to think twice. But this is what Jacob Zuma did. He created this environment of impunity. And he literally moved the chances of being apprehended, being prosecuted to zero, certainly for his cronies in the state. And they just lost the plot. They became blind by the amount that they could take. And the beauty, though, of digital fingerprints and emails and the Gupta leaks and everything else is that that never goes away. And it comes back if things change enough, as they have started to do, although not fast enough, and then the table swings, the pendulum swings, and those who are found wanting can be held accountable. So when you get that down to zero, or the chances of being prosecuted very low, anything really goes. And we see it in local government, we see it in provincial government. It has just permeated the entire levels of government. And this is where we have to work hard now, to get that back, that zero factor in prosecution back to 1 or as high as possible. When people know that the chances are of me being held accountable are going to be high enough. And we're frustrated at the slow pace of prosecutions in this country, but things are starting to turn. So let's have a look at what happened. From 2007, when Zuma wins overwhelmingly in Polokwane, and he tells Mbeki, I'm now number one, I'm going to be your boss. And it was literally from there onwards that state capture started to flow. In June 2008, the negotiations and the dealings with the Guptas is well underway when Zuma's daughter Duduzile is appointed as a director at Sahara Computers. And by September 2008, Thabo Mbeki is persuaded to resign, and Kgalema Motlanthe is put in charge to hold the fort, while Jacob Zuma in the background is doing a lot of work. By May 2009, Jacob goes on to become president with the ANC's majority win, and the work that he's doing to start to undo or to put in place the structures that would assist him in state capture are being put in place. By February 2010, we have the Sona speech. And in that speech, he announces 864 billion rand of infrastructure spend that was going to start taking place. And that's where state capture is funded. It's through infrastructure spending and through the SOEs, and I'll show you how that is done, that cleverly aligns funds to the two factors that come into play: people on the inside and people on the outside, businesses and so forth. By October that same year, he replaces 7 people on his cabinet. He puts Malusi Gigaba in charge of DPE, Public Enterprises, that is looking after these state-owned entities. And so the web of the Gupta's infiltration into getting Zuma to make appointments that suit this plan start to take place. And we see in 2010, on December the 7th, the New Age literally publishing the names of the board, the new board of Transnet, and predicting that Brian Molefe would become the CEO. And sure enough, the next day, we see the announcements of that entire board from the New Age, from Gigaba's speech. And a couple of months later, in February 2011, we see Molefe appointed as the CEO of Transnet, just as the New Age had predicted. And that starts to indicate how strong and how clear the game was being played. And those were the playing fields. The top 3, Eskom, Transnet, Denel, is where the Guptas really got involved in, but they didn't get involved in all aspects of state capture. We have PRASA, SAA, and Sanral, where there's a lot of corruption taking place, and not necessarily under the auspices of the organized state capture that we have come to know, but in Zondo's report, he speaks about a lot of the stuff that was taking place that was not really and necessarily Gupta related. And I want to share with you some of the factors that took place in a couple of graphs here. But you must know that as these SOEs were appointed, so you start to see these structures become disempowered when it comes to governance. We see SOE boards replaced, new CEOs put in place, and CEOs that are given a lot more power. And one of the factors that started to take place, but you have to look back at it, is this revaluation of assets and liabilities. Not so much the liabilities, but you have to revalue your assets in order to make your balance sheets look good so that you can start dishing out these lucrative bonds, good interest rates, and get the finance houses to give you the money. It wasn't the state that was going to give that 846 billion rand or 64 billion rand. It was going to come from lending houses, world banks, and it was coming with good interest rates as well. And so you can see, look at Transnet over that time, very quickly, if you have a look at the assets being revalued, so you can start pushing up your debt and your interest-bearing debt and your borrowings. And these are state-owned entities, remember, they're not JSE-listed companies, but the same rules apply. If you're going to invest, you need to be able to convince me as the investor to buy your bonds that those are going to be covered by the assets. And so all they did, and as IFRS allows, the International Finance Reporting Systems and the International Accounting Systems and structures allow you to revalue your assets, if those assets are realizable at those values. And that's not what happened here. And so you'll see the borrowings start taking place. Interest-bearing debt at Transnet goes up threefold in almost 4 years. If you just take a look at Denel, started a bit later, 2011, the same thing happens. They start revaluing their assets. Now, in Transnet's case and Denel's case, there was no additional infrastructure. And how do they unpack or equate the increase in the value of Transnet's rail network when traffic is moving or freight is moving from rail to road? The assets were not appreciating to that extent. Same thing in Denel. And I guess this one that makes it the worst is Eskom. If you just look in those first few years, asset values in their property and plant elements, which is the bulk of their assets, their total assets, jumps 75% from 2007 to 2009. And there were no new power plants put in place. Medupi was coming on board then. But how do you increase the value of these old power plants to that extent? And then again, from 2009 to 2010, another 29%. So nearly 100% in 3 years. Your assets, your old power plants, get revalued. And this is exactly why they did that, is so that this interest-bearing debt could start raising. So they could go out and give these government-guaranteed bonds and start bringing the debt on board and use that to plunder away. And you see Medupi taking 3-4 times longer than it should have been built at 3 times the cost. Kusile coming on board soon after that. And these were only just started then. And those assets were not allowed to be realized at this stage because they weren't even half built, quarter built by then. And so interest-bearing debt goes up from 50 billion to 100 billion rand in 2 years. And then you can see where this is going. The assets, those old power plants, are suddenly valued right up to almost 600 billion rand. But if you ask any investor, would you buy one of those power stations? You wouldn't. They certainly don't contain that value. And this is what happened with the interest-bearing debt. It went up from by 300 up to 360 billion rand in that short period of time from 2010 to 2017. And that's why Eskom is in the mess it's in today. Same thing at Sanral. Look at the road network, pretty static, and those assets grow massively. And one of the economists, transport economists, asked Nazir Ali, so now you're in trouble. What do you do as a state-owned entity? In a normal business, you would have to sell your assets if you're in trouble. Sell the ones you can to keep the debt at bay, to keep people who want their money back at bay. But you can't sell South Africa's roads. And so this has been a false situation. And what we do understand now is that if you talk to the lending houses, and I was speaking to them a while ago, who'd given a lot of money to these state-owned entities over this time, and asked them if this was a JSE-listed company, would you have lent them the money, knowing what was happening here? And they had to know because they should have gone back and seen and asked the question, why are you valuing your assets so high? Of course, that road network is massive. Of course, it might be valued at that if you had to rebuild it. But you cannot sell it. You cannot dispose of your assets, the country's assets. And so the regular involvement of the Guptas in state spending was there. I mean, it was there in the Free State with Estina, Nulani Investments, the Premier's laptops that he bought, Transnet, the locomotives, Regiments Consulting, McKinsey, the CDB loans with Transnet. They were all involved in those, the interest swaps with Regiments and Nedbank. Eskom, the sale of Optimum coal mine and the prepayment of coal for Tegeta, prepayment of coal, never happened with any other company. Denel Asia, the VR laser scandals, the New Age, getting all that business, the business breakfasts and government advertising spending. Their hands were so deep in this space. But it wasn't only confined to the Guptas, as I said. Aviation sector, SAA, Dudumnieni, Yaki Kwenani, the gates were opened. Everybody was now participating. SAA Technical, AXA. And then in the correctional services space, at Busasa, Busasa was around long before the Guptas came along. So much plundering taking place. And then, of course, in the release yesterday of the fourth volume, we see Gwede Mantashe's name. And the Zondo is saying, there's investigations that need to happen here. Gwede Mantashe is a potentially corrupt person, as far as Zondo is concerned. And he is saying to the authorities out there and the NPA, go and do your work as prosecutors. And then it's not only there, it's with businesses in the city of Joburg at the time and within the ANC, PRASA, the Tall Train, Swifamba, SARS and Bain. The list goes on. Not to mention what's been happening in provincial and local government. The plundering has just been massive from a state capture point of view. And the media exposure, and talking to what Alec is saying, week after week, headlines today, gone tomorrow, they continue, because what the politicians will do in this space as they infiltrate and influence what's happening in the administration is that this is sensationalism. This is speculation. These are political agendas that are being played. This is interference and using the media to interfere. And so parliaments were, and MPs within parliaments were convinced and to look away, to ignore this that's happening. And so Zuma survives many attempts to have him voted out in the no confidence votes in parliament. This party patronage, this cadre deployment, is so strong, and it allows this plundering to continue even though the headlines are there week after week, day after day, lots of dots. And the joining is very difficult without a commission, because the picture cannot be painted when it is all put down to speculation and political agendas. So they don't budge, and this issue of Parliament being asleep at the wheel, permitting the plundering to take place, is a reality. So then along comes the State Capture Commission, and I say nearly missed. We did nearly miss this because it was due to the report that was put forward by Thuli Madonsela, and thankfully Brian Mhlanga and Stanislas Muyebe and the DA's Musi Mahamani at the time lodged complaints with Thuli Madonsela. She was going out by December 2016, and she gets her report in just in time in October 2016. And that sets the ground for the state, the commission, because she recommends that a commission should take place. Obviously, over the next year, Jacob Zuma tries to fight that. He tries to have it set aside in court, and that Stalingrad process takes another year. But by December 2017, it is set aside or thrown out of court. The courts rule against him. And that same month, the ANC elections happen, and Cyril Ramaphosa comes into power. And then what happens is he's under pressure, Jacob Zuma. The court has set aside his attempt to try and have the report by Thuli Madonsela thrown out. And what happens is he then establishes the Judicial Commission, but with rules. He knows his time's running out, and he tries to hem it in and to ensure that everything that comes out of the State Commission is not going to be used. And so we see President Ramaphosa coming into play, forcing Jacob Zuma out, changing the terms of reference of the commission, allowing the evidence therein to play out in courts of law, in court cases going forward, and he broadens the terms well beyond just the state capture in those certain areas, but down to all spheres of government. And 3.5 years of Zondo starts. It starts on the 20th of August, the first oral statements given in August 2018. And here we are 3.5 years later with the reports being published in various volumes. But the stories that have come out in the Zondo Commission, the interviewing that has taken place, and the cross-questioning that has been taking place is critical, because a state, when you have a situation of a commission of inquiry, it's a judicial process, and it has powers. and it makes findings. And it makes very strong findings and then very strong recommendations. And that is no more speculation. A judge has ruled, he's made findings that have to be used, that cannot be ignored. And this is important for this country going forward. So what does he do? Well, he finds that, without a doubt, corruption, fraud, theft, and maladministration does take place. It's no longer speculation. It's no longer just headlines in the media and other people's agendas. And he also makes it very clear that people were not credible. They were untruthful. And that's stuff that the NPA cannot ignore. And then he gives recommendations. And those recommendations are powerful, and there's still more coming out in the final volumes. But he says that further investigations by law enforcement and the NPA must take place. So they can't ignore this, as they seem to have been doing over the last few years. He also recommends that there's amendments to legislation. Penalties need to start increasing. The NPA and PRECA and laws that govern the way we manage corruption need to be changed. He goes down hard on the NPA and says that accountability against perpetrators must start to take place. He suggests that the changes in the processes of selecting boards must change, and there's where we start to see civil society coming into play. And he asks for more insights from those entities such as SICA, URBA. These are organizations that are slightly outside of government but have powers, and they need to start playing their role. And we've been calling for that for some time at OUTA. And that whistleblowers need more protection. Now, these are all excellent recommendations in the fight against corruption. And if they start coming to fruition, then we're excited about what can happen going forward. So these recommendations are excellent. And just in closing, the question we're often asked is, well, was that 1 billion rand on the Zondo Commission worth it? And certainly was it the 3.5 years worth it? And of course it is. It's not a waste of money. In the greater scheme of things, 1 billion rand is nothing with what's been plundered. But if we didn't start this, then we'd be sitting here today with nothing, just speculation. But we have a document now, and Shamila Batoy and her crew have to start working. And that is why Hermione Cronje has moved on. She has not been producing in the investigative directorate, and we have to get the NPA to do its job. But remember, the NPA is under pressure. The NPA is still dealing with rape, with murder, with theft, with so much going on in this country. And we have to put this specific consensus, the specific focus areas in what Zondo is recommending, special courts as well, big focus, more money, more funding, to get those who profited from the crimes of corruption and maladministration in state capture into the space where they need to be, in the dock, in the courts, and eventually in jail.